Fly.
Now, little Bellingham lies in the middle of the North's finest countryside, and yet it has a grave there that is ominously cursed. An 18th century hellraiser, gambler and womanizer called Bowery Charlton spent much of his life in that area. His real name, William Charlton of the Bower, Reedsdale, at a time when the Charltons were one of the North's most powerful families. Yet the Jacobite rebellion would change much of that. The Crown dictated that no Catholic family could keep horses in case they joined the war alongside Bonnie Prince Charlie against the English Crown. So when a neighbour called Leadbitter, a fellow Catholic, heard that the government was sending a troop of soldiers to confiscate his horses and his black stallion that was worth a lot of money, Charlton decided to save the day. He hid the horse in the woods, but its neighing made the soldiers aware there was a horse out there. So at night, using hoists, Charlton lifted the horse up to the first floor of the stables, hid it behind hay bales. Problem was, the horse was thirsty, and there was no way for it to get any water without removing all the bales. So it began stamping and kicking out. So Charlton got onto its back, leapt down, and rode like hell for the River Tyne. The river at that time was very dangerous and in full flood, and that stopped any of the king's men from following. On getting to his fortified home, he hid the animal again and waited for a knock that never came. Eventually, Charlton did involve himself in the Jacobite rebellion and fought gallantly at the defeat of the Scots at Preston. Charlton, knowing his cause was lost, he returned to his home near Bellingham. But when Bonnie Prince Charlie threatened another war, the Crown arrested all of those loyal to him. And once in prison, Charlton, now in his late 50s, soon died due to ill treatment, poor diet. Death had been inevitable. He left 2 illegitimate daughters to 2 of his numerous lovers. They lived in Hexham, and whenever the church offered prayers for the royal family, the 2 daughters would walk out of the church in disgust. Bowery would have been proud of them. Now he's currently buried in Bellingham churchyard. And because he was betrayed by a local who pointed troops to his house, he cursed those who were jealous of his wealth. And it said if you put both hands on his grave and close your eyes tight, his spirit charges through you and shows you visions of the torture that he witnessed before he died. Malcolm Young, a historian from London, wrote, I'd heard of the so-called curse, and on seeing this grave in such an inauspicious cemetery, I had my reservations. Yet on clenching that mossy grave, I closed my eyes and saw bright flashes of people having their eyes burnt out with red-hot pokers. A man had one thrust into his fundament. Others were being cut and slashed, whilst other prisoners stayed terrified in cells, awaiting their turn. My stomach turned over as I felt their anxiety and their fear, and I felt myself having to tug my own hands away before I screamed out. It was truly one of the most disturbing things that I've ever done. In 2008, Scott Alec McGowan from Dundee visited Bellingham to see a relative, and he stopped off to see Bowery Charlton's grave, a Scottish hero figure. Well, not knowing the legend, he put both of his hands on the grave and suddenly found himself witnessing torture and murder, a woman having her ears and breasts cut off, the wounds cauterized with a red-hot poker. He said, I could smell the burning flesh. I heard the girl screaming until she passed out and just hung there on the manacles. It was a bright day, yet my mind was full of the dark dungeon where all kinds of horrible things were happening all around me. A man was roped down to a table and they were hammering nails into him. With each blow, everyone was being spattered by his blood, and at that moment, I felt a hand on my shoulder and yelled out. It was my cousin, and I pulled my hands away. This was like a direct link to another time. Charlton seems to watch over his grave and doesn't bear fools gladly. Now, if ever there was a ghost story that could be confirmed and be current, it's the situation in Killingworth. On April Fool's Day, an ordinary house. It looked like all of the others on the estate, and yet it experienced something horrible. There'd never been any ghostly activity there. The family had lived there for about 15 years without any sort of problem. Then they decided to change their house around, knocking down 2 small rooms together, making the resulting room their bedroom. Well, the work was done by friends and family, so it took rather longer than they'd planned. But they were finally in the latter stages. All that was needed was a bit of paint and the putting up of curtain rails. The residents do not wish to be identified, so we call them John and Mary. They have 2 children. The first sign that there was something different about the house was when Mary returned home to find the microwave on, the oven too, and the toaster, although there was nothing in it. She switched everything off and wondered if either of her children had done it. She picked them up from her mum's and asked them, and the little girl said, "No, it wasn't us. It was the man." On trying to find out who this man was, the answers her own children gave her did nothing to calm her nerves. "Oh, he comes to see me in my room every night," she said. Then the boy chipped in, "I've seen him on the stairs, just watching us. He says he's not very happy at what you've done." Mary went to the library the next day to ask what was on the land in Killingworth before the housing estate was built. It made her feel sick when they read old newspaper columns talking about the removal of old graves on the site of an old church. And on getting back home, her husband sat on the settee and asked her to sit down. He said, "I've just seen a ghost." His face was as white as a sheet, and as a tradesman, he wasn't prone to making things up. For him to say this, it was obvious he'd seen something. He held her hand and said, "I was watching TV when I felt that there was something or someone watching me, and I turned my head just slightly, and on the other side of the glass door into the living room, there was a tall man staring in. I turned my head right round. I could clearly see him with these huge eyes staring in. At first I thought it was a burglar, and as I sat up, he came through the doors without opening them and just vanished. I wanted to run, and then I remembered the kids were upstairs, so I ran up there to grab them, and they said, 'Daddy, don't be silly. He's here all the time.'" John said, "We are moving house." Mary then told him what she'd found out, and they started making inquiries. And on one night, 2 days later, rang Nightowls' main switchboard. They got a vicar out, and the blessing was not effective. And I was told that this was the case by the church itself. So I asked some people from a spiritualist church to go in. 2 did, and said that they experienced a man who loved the children, but were very angry that they were not his. Elizabeth, a spiritualist for 43 years, said his children had died very young, and now he'd chosen to make these 2 living children his. She said this is nothing straightforward. This is potentially dangerous. They had tried to move the spirit on, but they said that there was something to do with the house holding him there. Every day, something else would happen. One night as Mary kissed her daughter goodnight, something hit her hard in the kidneys, knocking the breath out of her. She tried not to let it show, or it would have upset the child. As she left the room, leaving it open in case she cried in the night, she looked back along the passage to the child asleep in bed when something closed the door. Despite her own blind terror, she went to the door and it wouldn't open. She ran down for John, who raced upstairs and put his shoulder to it, slamming it open. And there was the little girl sitting up. "Where's he gone, Mummy? Don't chase him away, he's really nice." Just at that moment, they heard a scream from the boys' room and both ran to the sound. The bed had been pulled from the wall and the lad was bouncing up and down. Then they looked towards the window, and there was the full figure of a man. The curtains blew in, and he was gone. They hugged the children, and for the next 3 months, all slept together. 3 times spiritualists paid them a visit, including 2 that I recommended from Yorkshire. Things calmed down for a week or so, but it was so obvious that that little, ordinary, modern house in Killingworth still had major problems. I visited the place, once with the family there and once without. When they were not there, it felt benign, gentle, a reasonably pleasant home. Yet when the family were there, the atmosphere was charged and heavy, and I felt headache and nausea, and the children became hyper. They were throwing out major energy, and it attracted a darker sort. On going upstairs with Mary, the rug rolled itself up outside the daughter's door. No sort of wind could have made that happen. Then on talking to the children, I was told that he throws us up in the air and catches us. We feel him touching us as we go to sleep. And if that was not alarming enough, the girl then said, "I don't know how he can see us when he has no eyes." The dad confirmed, just 2 empty black sockets that seemed to stare right through you. I headed off and made some calls, and it was almost as if this thing knew that something was coming. Neighbours began to see this eyeless face at the window when the family were out. They would hear cries and moans from the empty house. They could hear furniture being moved and banged against the wall. This caused them to call the family, who knew only too well what was going on. Then 6 days ago, they returned to the house, and there in their living room was the worst stench imaginable. And in the kitchen, the chip pan was on fire. The ring had been switched on and the kitchen was black with smoke. John drowned the fire out with a damp towel and proceeded to clean things up. On putting the children to bed with them, they heard the son's bed move next door, and on checking the room, it was upside down on the floor. Once in there, the door slammed behind him. It took him 10 minutes to get out. In the daughter's room, the bed was covered in toys that had been in boxes and on shelves in her toy cupboard. Then finally, as they all walked upstairs at the end of the night, there, at the top of the stairs, stood the dark figure staring down at them with eyeless sockets. Dad said, "Walk up, ignore it, into our bedroom." Mary was less sure, and at that, there was this angry roar. And they all raced down into the living room. The following day, an exorcist arrived and worked his way through the entire house and garden. During the ceremony, there was a huge crash, as if someone had hurled a wardrobe across the room. Yet nothing had been moved anywhere. 5.5 hours later, a knock at Mum's door. The job was done. As the family returned to the house, they could all feel that the dark, oppressive atmosphere had gone. It really did feel like a new house. Since then, barely a week later, all is well. Yet such is the demand for land to build houses on. Graveyards and cemeteries are being resituated all the time. The North has been such an incredible area for historical battling. I would be surprised if there wasn't anywhere where someone hasn't died. Then, all you need is a trigger. The massive energy of children at play. The change in the living energy of a home due to DIY. Add to that the removal of the dead. And who knows what could happen? How many other homes on that estate have had visitors watching their children as they sleep, wanting them for themselves?
Alan Robson, champion of the North.
All I have in this world is my balls and my word, and I don't break them for no one.